UFC champion versus Pride champion. Who's the best middleweight in the world? This time it was Anderson Silva taking out the very tough Dan Henderson. Both fighters considered some of the top pound-for-pound fighters in the entire world, and this time it was Anderson Silva getting the victory over Dan Henderson. It was a surprising fight. This fight considered by many to be a clinch battle. Who's going to win? Was it the Greco-Roman clinch or was it going to be the Muay Thai clinch? Neither fighter really employed that clinch game. In the end, it was a rear naked choke for Anderson Silva, winning after battering punishment from the back on the ground over a stunned Dan Hollywood Henderson, getting the victory in round 2, 4:52. In the second fight of the evening, we had Heath Herring take out Czech Congo. This is probably the least impressive fight of the night. Not impressive showing by either fighter, despite the fact that Heath Herring won the fight. You got to think that there's a lot of heavyweights out there in the UFC division salivating, licking their chops to get a chance at either fighter. Neither fighter looking impressive. Heath Herring gets this narrow split decision over Czech Congo after 3 rounds. Probably the fight of the night before it even took place. Alessio Sakara looked impressive against Chris Lieben, but in the end lost the fight. Alessio Sakara was impressive, very sharp with his shots, very impressive with his combinations, but Chris Lieben, in typical crippler style, took the fight, landing a haymaker, left hook, 2 of them in fact in a row, taking the fight at TKO 3:15 of the first round. You gotta think that Chris Lieben, despite the fact that he's winning all these fights, is not as technically refined as a lot of the other fighters. You gotta think that he's not going to be able to compete with the top guys at that division. However, he does take the victory here at 3:15. Yushin Thunder Okami looked impressive against former UFC middleweight champion Evan Tanner, taking the fight by ref stoppage from a knee and a punch at 3 minutes of the first round. Despite the fact that Evan Tanner had not fought in the UFC for almost 2 years, you got to think that's a pretty impressive victory for Okami, who actually holds a victory over the current champion Anderson Silva, winning by disqualification in Hawaii. John Fitch took out Chris the Professor Wilson after 3 rounds by unanimous decision. This fight was not quite as impressive as people might have expected from John Fitch, considering the fact that he was fighting a guy that fought in the UFC for the very first time. John Fitch, despite winning the unanimous decision, was not able to finish his opponent, and this is one of the major knocks against John Fitch. A lot of his fights go to decision. He doesn't seem to have the ability to close the deal, despite the fact that he's fighting a guy who fought for the very first time. Why he was even fighting a guy that's never fought in the UFC, considering he's got something about 7 wins in a row in the UFC, is beyond me. It's a problem that we also saw against Diego Sanchez, who defeated David Belkaden by tap out due to punishment at 4 minutes at 43 seconds of the first round. David Belkaden also stepping up big time, taking on one of the former top contenders in the welterweight division, Diego Sanchez, also fighting in the UFC for the first time. You gotta wonder, why is this guy fighting a guy that's so experienced in his very first fight? However, Diego Sanchez is impressive, getting the tap out due to punishment at 4:43. John Halverson in other action goes down to George Gurgel by decision. Gurgel, you gotta imagine that he's probably on the card because of the fact that it is in his hometown. However, he does get the decision after 3 rounds. Andrei Arlovsky gets the victory over Irish Jake O'Brien by TKO in round 2. This is a huge fall from grace for Andrei Arlovsky, who's gone from being one of the main event fighters down to a preliminary dark match. This fight was not even shown on pay-per-view. It's amazing to see the guy that's a former UFC heavyweight champion, main event fighter, go from winning against Fabricio Werdum to fighting in a preliminary fight. This is another bit confusing decision by the UFC. He does win the impressive victory, taking the TKO at round 2. However, you gotta think that his future in the UFC might be on a little bit of a shaky ground, considering the fact that this guy is on a preliminary bout. Fioravanti gets a unanimous decision over Luke Kumo, winning after 3 rounds, taking out the former Tough 2 veteran. Dustin Haslett, probably in the fight of the night, losing to Josh Koscheck via TKO, 124 of the second round. Impressive victory for Josh Koscheck, coming off a loss. This is a good fight for him, considering the fact that he didn't look altogether all that impressive against GSP, despite the fact he is fighting one of the top fighters in the world. He took a lot of punishment in this fight, as a matter of fact, including a flying knee from the impressive Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belt Dustin Haslett. That was your UFC 82 Pride of a Champion recap from Arnold the Sushiboy Lim, representing MMARingReport.com. This report was sponsored by Clinch Fight Gear, the official shorts of Dan Hollywood Henderson. Thank you so much for joining us today.